Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this week's Inspiring Leadership podcast. And I'm delighted to have David Kamenir. David is the VP for North America at Novo Nordisk, and which is a fascinating company. It's based in Denmark, and you would have heard of products like Wegovy and Ozempic. It's making a huge difference to the health landscape and what it does. So, David, welcome. Great to have you on the podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be here. This is my
Yeah.
first podcast, so I'm excited.
Yeah, well, look, it's great to have you in the first podcast. And I remember back 350 podcasts ago to my very first podcast. And now I feel I'm starting to get in the swing of things. But I think it's when I get to 10,000 podcasts, then I know I'm starting to get the hang of it. I'm still learning. But David, tell us about Novo Nordisk. It's a company I've heard a lot about, fascinated by its incredible success, which we'll talk about later. But how does it help individuals around the world?
Sure. So the organization has a 100-year history, for those who don't know a lot about it, uh, all the way back to insulin and bringing insulin into, excuse me, into Denmark. And the real goal is, and what we've been successful with over time, is helping people live longer and lead healthier lives. And I think the company has put a lot of focus, not I think, the company has put a lot of focus on really changing the way changing the landscape, changing diabetes, changing obesity more recently. We're in rare disease, so helping patients who have very, very challenging and diseases that are very uncommon. And rare disease is something that's, you could say, individually rare, but collectively common, with more than 25 million patients with a rare disease, right? Over 7,000, I believe, rare diseases. So it's a challenge. I think us spanning the spectrum from those challenging conditions all the way through managing and even preventing chronic conditions has been something that's helped millions of patients around the world.
Yeah, I mean, the whole health scene is now such an issue, and I've been studying and following, which is why when this opportunity came for your company asked me to have you on, I was very interested about this because I've been studying it for some time, the whole health, longevity, wellness, fitness training, what you eat, the medicine you take. And a bit like those who are in functional medicine, Dr. Mark Hyman, I like listening to quite a bit of his work, and various other people, Dr. Sinclair as well. This idea of going upstream rather than being the national sickness service that we have in the UK, how about making it a health service, a service that has preventative health measures? And clearly, there's a whole industry around ultra processed food, which makes you sick. And then the cynics would say the pharmaceutical companies then just come in to sort of keep you living longer, but they don't make you better. But actually, I think a number of these things are making people better. So I'm delighted having you on and the work you guys do. Now, in your role as the vice president for enterprise strategy, how are you sort of balancing short-term pressures on hitting the numbers with sort of longer term strategy and goals of doing things which make a difference to people's health, longevity, and wellness?
That's a great question. And one thing that you mentioned that I'm reflecting on, we've had uh, CEOs of consumer packaged goods companies and food companies call our CEO and let him know that their sales are down. So it
Wow.
shows you the impact that we've been able to have on reversing some of the challenges that people have had with the ultra processed foods and the lifestyle that's crept into modern society over the last several decades, increasingly.
Yeah, I mean, 92.5% of Americans are metabolically unhealthy. And the Brits, we're not much different. And there's people all over Europe. And even some of the studies had in the Amazon, there was up the Amazon, there was various sort of places where people stop off and goods were dropped off, but most people were eating local produce. And then one of the companies, let's protect them, but anyway, one of the big ultra processed chocolate food sort of companies started to take a riverboat with all their chocolate products and ultra processed food products. And within a year, they had never had obesity. They suddenly all had obesity around these little depots on the river where they were selling their famous products that we all eat in large amounts in this country. And of course, it's designed by men and women in white coats with hats on to make it super attractive and palatable, almost of the same consistency as and sugar content of breast milk, so that you just can't resist some of these things. So people are now in quite a bind that they are hooked, addicted. It's an addiction. They're addicted to ultra processed food, can't get themselves off it, or in what they call food deserts, where there's no fresh food, there's just ultra processed food, and it's cheaper. And then of course you've got the problem in America with food stamps, and of course the companies like Coke and others love to sell their products through food stamps. So the poorest are eating the most unhealthy diet, and the whole industry is geared around, their budgets, which are larger than some countries' GDPs for Coca-Cola. But no one has a big budget for broccoli and a big advert campaign for eat broccoli. It's all the ultra processed food. What's your thoughts?
It is a huge challenge because it's so multifactorial. The conditions that you just mentioned, I worked for consumer packaged goods in consulting when I came out of school, and the goal there, I mean, the way these things are engineered is which is what they are. They're engineered to make you want to eat more. They're packaged in ways to make you want to eat more, and that's really where it becomes a challenge. There are, I've read, heroin-like qualities to
Mm.
some of these ultra processed cookies, for example. I won't name names, but that it has an addictive nature to it.
Oh yeah.
And I think that's been just a tremendous challenge. And you combine that with tons of other factors, environmental, et cetera, that just make it a real challenge to not be metabolically disadvantaged, right? Or compromised. And I read also somewhere where 99% of the chemicals we have, and don't quote me on this because, but I think it was eye-opening at least, didn't exist in the 1950s, let's say, right? So you have all these other endocrine disruptors potentially, right? Phthalates, BPAs, tons of chemicals that are out there that already can have an influence on your metabolic regulation. And then, of course, the ultra processed foods and the way your body is just unable to process and doesn't know what to do with them
Yeah.
is really at the crux of this. So when people think a calorie is a calorie, not really. If your body's responding to a certain calorie in one way that's more organic in nature and something that's been made in a lab.
Yeah, and the whole area and the research around the microbiome and the holobiome, which is the whole of our body, as you say, chemicals and things like that are affecting that. But the microbiome, which is essentially this long tube through our body, and and how the bugs, so there's so many bugs in it, sort of more bugs that are not us than the bugs that are part of us. That these foreign bodies that live within us to help us digest all these foods, they all get affected by the ultra processed food in ways, as you say. And I know that if I got hold of a packet of, I don't know, some kind of chocolate hobnobs or something like that, I probably end up eating the whole packet. But yet now I know, and there's some good work by the book is called Atomic Habits by James Clear. And he said when it's things like food that ultra processed food and biscuits and cookies and things like that that are not good for you, make them as difficult as possible to get access to. Like I do the shopping online, so I don't do the shopping when I'm hungry. If I do the shopping when I'm hungry, I'm going to buy lots of ultra processed junk, and I really only once in a while will ever go past a junk food outlet and stop by it. But it's got to be pretty desperate, and nothing else is available. But I find now I'm eating far healthier, and I've stopped taking ultra processed food. I had a liver challenge, and
Mhm.
it's cleaned up my liver by just completely coming off them. And the liver has repaired itself within 6 weeks. All the blood work was back to normal. Um, but
I,
the other thought I had was you do in Novo Nordisk a huge amount of work on diabetes care, another chronic disease. Ozempic and Wegovy, which I think from my research accounts for 55% of your sales of 18.4 billion in 2023, and it's growing 36% annually. Um, amazing what's going on. How does this particular mission influence your leadership style and your decision making that you make, David?
Really in a couple ways, and I'll be happy to answer that. I realize I didn't answer your last question about balancing short and long-term goals, so we can certainly get back to that if you'd like.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh,
Do that one first. Do that one
okay,
first.
okay. No, I think that so just the topic you brought up is so interesting. I tend it's hard to get back to the questions that you're asking because you brought up some great points, and I have lived by the philosophy. You said you made some adjustments yourself. We all have to. That you shop the perimeter of the supermarket, and if it's not in your house, you can't eat it, right? So there's certain things you could do that just really try to control what is very, very difficult otherwise for almost everybody. And I've even have personal experience. You might have the same where once you go off the wagon a little bit and eat some of these ultra processed foods, one day becomes 2 days, 3 days, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and then you realize you're in a little bit of a cycle. But by stopping it, which also signifies how much there is an addictive quality to it of sorts, it takes a couple weeks sometimes to stop, and then you realize once you've purged it from your system that and you're not eating those things anymore, that you feel better and you don't want them as much anymore. So that just gives you some signal as to how they're made, how they're
Mm.
engineered, and how they're designed to make you want to eat more of them. So I could talk about that all day, but I do want to get to what you asked.
Mm.
On the short-term versus long-term balance, I mean, that is really at the crux of what we do. You could say, especially as an operational region where the majority of our focus in North America is on the short term, short to mid-term, but we need to do both because we are a lead market. So we're setting the pace for the rest of the world. And for me, it's making sure that we have that balance and have dedicated time and importantly, the proper context for the latter, for making those longer term decisions. And I recall just a recent example. We had an executive team offsite and myself, our head of portfolio strategy, our head of finance, all provided the bookends for that. But the majority of that focus was on the short to midterm for the therapy area business plans. So when I was putting together my opening for that, I thought, well, how much should I bring in the long term to this? Too much, it ends up kind of distracting the focus because we weren't going to talk about that during that session, during that few day offsite. But none, then it becomes a surprise and the proper context isn't provided. So what I did was I teased it. I said, these are some big issues, some of which you might see today, but the rest you'll see in November. And that's where we just try to make sure that the flow and cadence of how we balance the short and long term is well managed so that we're constantly thinking about them in a almost a yin yang type of way.
Mm, that's a good one. And then thank you for that. And then on to the other question I was
Yep.
asking you about your sort of the mission that you've got and the leadership style and the decision making that you make when you've got these the
Yep.
success and diabetes and chronic diseases. Tell me more.
It's interesting that you started with the consumer packaged goods industry, if you will, because that's where I started out of school, my career in consulting. And I loved it. I thought it was great. I was a kid essentially coming out of school, yet I was flying to Atlanta to meet with Coca-Cola. I was working on Nabisco, other products and other brands and companies, and we were working on major nine-figure marketing mix decisions for them. So we had some very good methodologies by which we can tell them exactly how much more they could sell if they did increased advertising, different changes to the promotional mix. So I thought it was great. In college, just reversing back a few years, I was at the crux of, or at the inflection point between pre-med and business school. And in school, in some of these schools, you have to decide pretty early in your second year, and then you go into another school if you're going to go business, or you go down a different track of pre-med. And at the time, my cousin was a med student, and maybe I was overly influenced in the opposite direction just because of the way the healthcare system was changing. But it didn't. It felt like the ability to just practice medicine was becoming a little bit more distant, right? Based on just how the healthcare and the medical field was evolving and all the players that were emerging into it, managed care, et cetera. So rightfully or wrongfully, I was steered away from that, or I steered myself away from that and went in the other direction. This experience, though, reminded me of that, and maybe a year or two into this role in consulting, I realized, what am I doing?
Mm,
The best I could do with all of my efforts is to get people to eat more crackers, cookies, drink more soda. And I thought, this is not aligned to my value proposition, my core values.
mm,
It's just not. So I had to make a shift. And I decided I found Novo Nordisk. We found this company and it was small in the US, but I was just amazed by the mission that they had. They have a dedicated arm at the time to cure diabetes, right? And that puts the company out of business. But and especially when diabetes was the focus for the most part of the company. But that's the kind of organization it was. It's majority owned by a foundation, so there's an ability to take that long view. But I thought this is interesting. So applied for a role, convinced them that I could do what they were asking, and they liked the fast life cycles that I was involved with consumer packaged goods. So they gave me a chance to work on the launch brands coming in, and I've been there ever since. So it was just a way in which I had a pretty big inflection point, first in school, and then kind of got checked against that in the real world, and then pivoted back in the direction that was at least closer to my core values.
mm. Well, I think it's lovely to find somebody who's living their life on purpose rather than off purpose. And it is I'm very fortunate that there's podcasts and the work I do with CEOs and teams is completely aligned with me wishing to inspire leadership by connecting people with a brave heart. And so yeah, living your life on purpose rather than just doing a job which makes money, but actually it's making people sick who not only just sick, but with diabetes, people will die. People die or they'll have limbs removed or whatever it might be. But I just don't know quite how some people working in some of these industries, particularly the big soda companies, can actually look themselves happily in the face and go, I'm doing a great job. This is part of a balanced diet. No, it's not part of a balanced diet. Don't have it at all. Drink water. That's perfectly good for you. But we've all been convinced and brainwashed, and it's appearing everywhere. It's on the screens everywhere, convincing us to take stuff which is gonna kill us or is certainly gonna make us very sick. But then, of course, because one person has it, their partner has it, their children have it, their grandchildren have it, and so it goes on. Um, I'm really pleased that you've found something that is aligned to what you
And
do.
you mentioned earlier, it is difficult. There are certain areas where, like you said, food deserts, where a disproportionate amount of the offerings in that area are packaged goods,
Mm,
right? So it becomes a vicious cycle of, let's say, not having a lot of outdoor space to move around, or it's not safe. So therefore, exercise could be limited. Obviously, economics could also limit that. The food choices that are available, not just which ones you can afford, but that are available, become a challenge too. So it does become often a very challenging, vicious cycle in certain places where it's not as simple as just, like I said earlier, shopping the perimeter. I mean, I was speaking for, would I do myself or would I try to do myself? But there's areas where it's just almost impossible in some ways to get out of that cycle because you just don't have it in the region or the geography that you're living in. So
yeah.
it's a great point you made earlier, and one that we've got some good efforts to try to partner with those areas and help prevent that. We have cities changing diabetes and some other programs where we're just really trying to change the way in which these diseases take hold.
Yeah, and I think there's one of the guys, Palin, who said, "Eat real food and not too much."
Yep.
Um, and the
Yep.
other one was the longer the shelf life of these packaged goods, the shorter your life. So when you're eating stuff that's got a really long, hey, great, it's last 3 years. You just know it's got so much junk and preservatives and fillers and preservatives in there that it's not going to be good for you. Fresh food is if we can, it's always the best stuff. Um, Talking about the pharmaceutical company, the industry, really, what do you think are some of the biggest challenges for the pharmaceutical industry today, and how, through your strategy in Novo Nordisk, do you reckon you're addressing some of those challenges?
That is a good question. I think the healthcare system is challenging across the board. There are a lot of different stakeholders, and there's both established and you could say emerging intermediaries between what gets developed in a lab and what a patient ultimately is on, if you're talking about a therapeutic intervention. the economics of care in context of that are also getting more difficult, all while we're facing, you could say, a mounting and increasing healthcare provider shortage. Depending on the data you look at, we could be upwards of 200,000 doctors short within 8 to 10 years, right?
Wow.
So you have more people on insurance, which is great. You have a lot of people that are involved, or a lot of entities that are involved in the healthcare system, which makes it complex, but you don't have enough doctors. And it's really difficult when you don't have enough doctors. So there's a confluence of forces that are happening, I think, at the same time that results in a shaky healthcare system, you could say, which is why you could see the amount of focus and attention that's had on a national level around that. And you see what it looks like as a percentage of GDP, right? That's always a tracker. But overall, and where most important is when you're an individual patient and it becomes difficult to navigate through that system. So, I mean, I think we see these challenges like others do, and we're working on a lot of things, but ultimately our goal is to ensure that the therapies that we make reach the patients who need them. And for me, as a strategist, it's really important to have that North Star and not lose sight of that mission, despite how complex the healthcare system gets or how challenging it is to bring new innovation to a receptive market. So that's where I think one thing that we put a lot of emphasis on is making sure that within all the noise that exists in any company, but certainly within a greater healthcare ecosystem, staying focused on what are we trying to achieve. And what we're trying to achieve is improving outcomes and making sure that our products reach the patients who need them. So I think the purity of a mission like that and simplicity in the face of complexity, I think is really something that's helped us navigate a large organization to a very common goal and galvanize the organization around that common goal.
Yeah, and you're making me think back to a comment one of the Navy SEALs said to me on one of the podcasts. He said, I can't give people certainty, but I can give them clarity. And I think your job in strategy is to have the clarity because you can't be certain about what the future holds, whether it be a shortage of 200,000 doctors or what the next big heroin-like food addiction is going to be that makes people eat the wrong kind of foods and drink all the pop sodas. I do think it's fascinating, but I really like the sound as I got to know you about the fact that it's a majority owned by the foundation and that they're doing things like really trying to make obesity just something which no longer happens, a bit like curing some other diseases that eventually they get cured completely. That would be phenomenal achievement if they could. And a number of my different clients around the world, some of them as they've struggled with not necessarily obesity, but just their weight has affected their mood. They've been feeling pretty down about themselves. They tried different diets, they tried different approaches, and then when they've used a couple of your products, Ozempic or Wegovy, whichever, it's different names in different places, it really has helped them a lot. But the key, of course, as you'll be telling me, is that as they are taking those, I think they inject themselves, don't they? They take it once a week or whatever they do, that they have to keep their training up for the muscles because what happens is if as they're losing weight, they also lose muscle as well. So if they're pretty fit men that I know, they've got to actually keep the muscle training going. Otherwise, you'll get what appears to be a lot of weight loss, but actually part of it is muscle loss. Any views on that, David?
Which is the case if you do it without medications as well, right? I mean, it's never going to be a pure adipose or fat loss. There's always some muscle loss. The question is the ratio, and and future generations of these GLP-1A products have a better ratio, uh, very much aligned to how it would work if you just do diet and exercise and a training plan. So they're pretty close now, but they'll be even better.
Yeah, we were chatting about this before these are early versions, and just explain to the layman GLP-1A. But I was quite excited by the next versions of what are coming that will be even more effective but provided that you keep it as part. I mean, this is genuine, unlike the Coca-Cola false advert. Oh, have it as part of a balanced diet. I would never have a Coke as part of a balanced diet, but you can have something which is really helping you with the weight loss, like Ozempic or Wegovy, plus eating good, healthy, fresh food, and also doing exercise, cardio, and weight-based exercise. What's your thoughts?
Sure. And these actually aren't early versions. We've had this in development and on market for almost 20 years. We had Victoza beforehand. It was an earlier version. Saxenda was an earlier weight loss drug. Victoza was for diabetes. So these are next generation already in Ozempic and Wegovy, and super, super powerful agents. That's why you've heard of those, but not the other ones probably that I just mentioned. But they continue to improve. And some of these are combinations that will be in place of different agonists and peptides and therapeutic treatments that are combined in a way that are even more effective. But the ones that we have now are super, super effective, and it is designed to be a combination of lifestyle changes as well, right? So these are super helpful, but like any medication, for the most part, or like many of them, I should say, there are other things you have to do to get the most out of them. And
Yeah,
for this one, or at least for Wegovy, when you're talking about obesity and specifically in that condition, it's very helpful to think about it as a holistic issue. It's a holistic problem, right? It's a multifactorial problem, and it's a multifactorial solution. So combining the therapeutic intervention with diet, exercise, lifestyle changes, etc. That's where people have had the most success for sure
yeah,
over
yeah.
time.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And things like sleep, people don't realize the impact on weight loss of having sufficient sleep. When you have a shortage
Yeah,
of sleep, you tend to get the ghrelin and get kicks in and various other things, and people go, oh, the hunger, rah, rah, rah," and they start to eat the wrong kind of food. So, good amount of sleep will actually help you lose weight as well as eating the right kind of diet, doing your exercise, doing the weight bearing exercise, resistance training. Let's turn the. Go on, Dave. You were going to say
no,
something.
I was going to say, and you see some of that with shift workers and people who work through the night and have just really things that challenge the natural circadian rhythm. And they're often more likely to have metabolic disruption. So there are a lot of factors along the spectrum of how you live and how you um, kind of operate within the modern environment, whether it's different hours, blue light, screens that throw things off. So you're right, there are a lot of things outside of exercise, diet, and these are some heavyweight ones, but there are a lot of things as well that can be done just to regulate how the body's supposed to operate and how it did operate for many, many, many years, right? Before we had
Yeah.
these technological advances, if you want to call them that, but they also have some big challenges, right?
Yeah, we take two steps forward and certainly about five backwards. I think of my time in my 20 years as an army officer. Often I was having to do shifts throughout the night and be on guard duty as a young officer cadet. And it completely throws your circadian rhythm. And I think of my stepson who's a police officer, and he's doing nights and then days and then nights and then days, and it's really not good. And the poor old airline industry, those guys who are flying, they've got challenges with cancer as a result of
Yep.
being their circadian system completely out. So it's not an insignificant impact on people. It's seriously tough on people. Let's turn it back to you personally, David. You're a fascinating guy, and you've um, really chosen a role now, getting away from the ultra processed packaged goods and the damage they do to doing something that you feel has a real calling. But also, this has a connection with you personally in the medical challenges, and you've had a fair few yourself and other relations. So, would you be willing to share a bit about yourself?
Sure. I mean, so part of it is I'm a strategist for a major biopharmaceutical organization, but I've also been on the other side as a bit of a chronic patient. I spent 4 years in my late teens through college, really, with an undiagnosed chronic pain issue. So I know how hard it is and was, and that's not the only thing I've had, but I refer back to that because I know how hard it was to find answers And it's especially hard when you're struggling already and when the system that you're facing is very fragmented, and it's even more so today. It's just hard to navigate through that. The medical system works well, I would say, if there's nothing wrong with you, right? Maybe you go to a PCP once in a while. You can get an appointment, most likely, even though that is also facing shortages. But it's when something goes wrong, that's when you realize, ooh, this is difficult. And you can easily get lost in the system. It happened to me. And you continually vacillate between, hope and defeat. You go see a new doctor, you find them, you think this is going to be it, then it's not, and then they give up, and then you don't hear from them again, and then you start from scratch. And I went through that for years, so I know what that's like. And I spent many days in the Library of Science and Medicine as a 19-year-old, searching through the books and searching through the records, trying to find some answers myself so that I could further pursue them with doctors. And I've been to some major centers, no answers. And it's just very difficult. So I know how that's like. And this was before, right? I was still in school. So this is when I was thinking medicine. But it did lead me to have tremendous empathy for patients, and something that will never go away, because I know what it's like. And that's part of one big reason why you could say I put a high emphasis, at least on the work that I touch, to ensure that we're focused on the North Star that's around improving outcomes, that's around a patient-centric ambition. It's something I introduced to this organization some years ago. Um, Finances, success, growth, those are all great, and people talk about those things, and you need them, right, to be successful. You could say you have to do well to do good. But if we're not focused on a patient-centric mission, and I'm certainly not saying that I created that, just in terms of our strategy and what we were looking at, introducing a more patient-centric mission, or a more patient-centric ambition, I should say, it was powerful, and it's something I pushed hard for, because I
Mm.
thought that that's what it's about. And again, part of that is my own personal experience. Part is the business, what I mentioned earlier about staying very focused on what we're trying to accomplish in a very challenging system. And what we're trying to accomplish, and it's in the mission of the company all over the place, but making sure strategically that people are focused on that, especially when you're heavily focused on execution, making sure that people are focused on what success looks like. And success, to me at least, and success to the organization, looks like people get better, their outcomes improve, maybe you prevent even the diseases, or certainly the downstream complications of these diseases. Obesity is a gateway disease with more than 200 different problems that could arise from it. If you stop it early, you prevent a lot of those things, right? So being focused on that North Star that includes the patient is something that's super important to me, and something that I'm super grateful that the organization values as well. And it's all over the materials. You could see it not only in the annual report, but it's how we live. It's the programs we have as a company. It's the way in which we've got prevention arms for obesity, not just diabetes, obesity. So we're looking at how to prevent people from becoming obese, right? So it's part of the mission of the company, but it's also something that's very, very important to me.
And I can really tell that it comes across very, very much almost through every fiber of your body. In a moment, we'll talk a bit about early childhood, growing up, who influenced you as a leader and what you went through as you were growing up. But let's just come back to that. Obesity is a gateway disease which has connected to it 200 other diseases. Now, that is a huge statement. 200 other diseases. If you're obese, you can end up with 200 different diseases. Is that what I understand?
That's what I believe, is my understanding. I don't quote me on the actual number, but
No,
that's
no,
what
but
I've
it just
heard. But
even if it's anything over just like one other, I mean the fact is,
exactly. So it's similar to COVID also, right? It can impact 200 different conditions. So I think what it suggests is, when you hear those numbers, that almost everything that could go wrong can, when you have these massive sort of gateway diseases like obesity. And it spans from everything, right? There's higher cancer risk, orthopedic issues, right? There's higher levels of knee replacements, et cetera. So things that you wouldn't normally think about, but of course, all the things associated with metabolic dysfunction and cardiovascular risk, cardiometabolic conditions, et cetera. So there's a lot that can happen. The body is a lot more connected than many think. You mentioned earlier the microbiome, the gut-brain axis. the connection between potentially, at least, early Alzheimer's and dementia and some of the
Yes.
other conditions, right, that are metabolic in nature, the role of neuroinflammation and a lot of different conditions. So these things are much more linked. And when you have something like obesity, which puts such a strain on the system, and for some people more than others, some can get away with it more than others can.
Yeah.
Others, it doesn't take much to flip that switch, right? They have kind of a lower threshold and maybe even more of an aggressive form of obesity where it's just much, much harder to treat. That's where you just see the impact that a disease like this, obesity, has on health and lifespan and quality of life.
Yeah.
And
And
that's also a reason why upwards of 90% of people with diabetes, type 2 diabetes, are overweight or obese.
mm, yeah. And this is where, if only, and I do think governments go through this agony. Um, do we over mollycoddle and sort of tell people they can't have this and they can't have that, or do we just let them get on with it themselves? Well, look what's happened when they let us get on with it ourselves. Sugar, white death, as it's known as in the medical profession, is really not good for us, but it's put into so many products that we often don't know about it. Um, and there was that whole gamification of the industry, making, oh no, let's reduce low fat, low fat, it's really good for you, have this low fat this. But we didn't know that they were pumping in loads of sugar into it to make it palatable, because you
Exactly.
can't have fat and no sugar. It tends to make it very difficult. So they the governments, like in our country, have shied away. They've done a little bit with reducing sugar, but they could do much more monitoring of the ultra packaged processed foods and the junk food, and stop it being in our schools, or lots of the outlets that are just outside our schools, or the vending machines that are in school where the kids are getting junk food rather than eating real food in the canteen. There's a whole range of things that we can do early on, and indeed in workplaces. I mean, where where my son works, they got to save money. They got rid of the police canteen where they were being fed real food. And instead, there's just a vending machine. And so these guys who are working terrible shifts, late nights, all they can do is a vending machine or get a pizza or a burger. That's the last joint that's open. So there's a real problem there. Let's need some people making some difficult decisions. Talking of which, let's talk about a difficult decision that you've had to make in work, and indeed in your life, and and also talk a bit more about your life. I'd love to hear more about your life.
Sure. So if we, whoops, I think if, sorry, just knocked the microphone
That's
over.
okay. That's okay.
If we're looking at, so I talked a little about Novo Nordisk, but if you go back, let's say, just to take people back for a little bit, about 100 years plus, we, or Novo Nordisk Insulin Laboratorium, commercialized the production of insulin after it was extracted and purified, or that technique was brought to Denmark from Canada by August Crowe. And he did it for his wife. She was a doctor living with diabetes and brought it forward. I think it was a Nobel laureate. But with insulin, diabetes was no longer the death sentence, and the life expectancy improved dramatically. I remember when I started with this company, they showed some photos of people with type 1 diabetes, and that's autoimmune. So that's not something that's preventable, at least at this point. There's some early therapies in development, but that's something that just is an autoimmune in nature. But they showed pictures of these people, just these young people, emaciated, because they would tell you, just don't eat, and you might make it for a little while, right? Like weeks in some cases. So it was a death sentence, particularly type 1 diabetes, when you no longer had a beta cell functioning in your pancreas. You couldn't survive. And with no insulin, people take it for granted a little bit now, right? Similar to maybe the polio vaccine, but it was a death sentence. So life expectancy improved dramatically. So that's the history. If you think about Novo Nordisk and just the way in which that disease state was treated just 100 years ago, and diabetes has been around a long time. So a massive challenge with an unbelievable intervention that dramatically changed the life expectancy. In fact, so much that some of these other comorbidities, which didn't even, or less likely to show up if you unfortunately didn't live that long, now start showing up. But there are people who live very normal lives, even with type 2, type 1 diabetes for decades and decades and decades. But that's the history. If you
Mm.
fast forward then to 2017, let's say, in Novo Nordisk, we were coming off of, I think, a 47 straight quarter double-digit growth period. We did see some concerning trends in the market, and we did have some very challenging discussions around our core value proposition, especially as our growth in the US just flattened out completely. So part of the impetus behind me proposing a much more strategically agile approach, and I proposed that to the C-suite, which ultimately led to creating this current role that I'm in now. But it was a bit of a wake-up call that we had to drive trade-offs, focus in on some must-win battles versus trying to do equally well at everything. So we did end up making some difficult decisions that, in context of our 100-year-old success or company history with significant pride in insulin, we did see a need to shift our commercial focus. We're still majorly committed to insulin and its production, its availability across the planet for people who need it. But I'm specifically talking about our commercial focus. This was a business strategic decision to put more emphasis on those GLP-1 agonists.
And just
Set,
quickly, GLP-1, does it, the way it works, it suppresses people's appetite. Is that the idea in simple terms? Or it's very complex, I'm sure. But if I made it very simple,
in simple terms,
yeah. Okay. Thank you.
everyone has some of that, but these are very long lasting. So they have a much greater impact on your ability to not have the same sort of urge toward food and potentially other things as you
Yeah.
might otherwise.
Yeah, because
So
it can also have a side effect on people who are addicted to alcohol or drugs. It helps a bit there, doesn't it?
potential,
It's not for that reason, but it can help a bit.
potentially, I mean, some of those things are being studied, not just by us, but we also have areas of exploration or clinicals in early Alzheimer's and other areas. But yeah, there have been some reports, at least, and there's again in studies to some degree for its effect on other urge-like
Yeah.
behaviors, if you will.
Sorry, I
Um,
interrupted you, but do
no,
carry on.
that's good.
This
So
is fascinating.
so so that was shifting a little bit more toward those therapies, to set the stage for the next generation, which was, and what people know now as Ozempic and Wegovy. So I mentioned we had Saxenda and Victoza, which were for obesity and diabetes, and now we have Wegovy and Ozempic, and we still have those other assets, but these are the ones that are just much more powerful agents. And I know I recall being pretty adamant that we had to at least make some trade-offs and some shifts in our commercial focus, because we had gotten to the point where we were very big and we were, again, almost doing something for everything, because we just had so much passion behind all of our therapies and all of our products, and they all worked very well. So they all had their place. But when you can do that when you have double-digit growth for 12 years. When you have no growth in this region, at least North America, you have to make some decisions around, okay, how do we shift our emphasis commercially, resources, effort, et cetera. So we made some of those shifts, and allowed us. It was really the first time where we had to make some significant trade-off decisions, which is what strategy is all about. It's about
Mm,
choice.
mm.
So I think that's something that was a bit difficult, and it took quite a few runs in the C-suite before we landed on something that made sense. But it worked out well for setting the stage for the next assets that we have on the market now, and we see the uptake of Ozempic and Wegovy well beyond what we expected.
Yeah, and is there a brand name yet that you can tell us about, which is like the next generation beyond Ozempic and Wegovy? Can you give us an early taster of what it's going to be called? Is there a name, or is
Not
it
yet,
not out
not
yet?
yet. We're not that has everything has its sequence. We're not there yet.
Okay. Well, look, when you
Still
do,
in.
let me know. Let me know. But yeah, I was talking earlier because I think your own experience of growing up and why you value the things you do, and you had from my understanding, a pretty tough upbringing. Just tell us a bit about it, if you would, and how it shaped you and who shaped you as the leader you are today.
No, I think so. Most of my family, or much of it, runs their own business. So growing up, I worked for my stepfather's mechanical contracting firm throughout school, and I really developed a good sense of entrepreneurial spirit, if you will. I've had others. My father has spent a career with a single large corporation. I have an uncle who was 37 years as a police officer, who rarely took a day off, by the way, which I thought was interesting at the time. So I guess you could say I've experienced and maybe blended both sides of that, how to be entrepreneurial within a large matrixed organization. So I think where that's helped is been able to read the tea leaves about where the company's going. A lot of people move into pre-existing roles, but a good part of my career building has been either things that didn't exist or maybe they were broken. I started several functions in this organization. I've had multiple roles, including the current role, which also didn't exist, but reading the tea leaves, seeing where the company maybe needed to pivot. And it wasn't even intended to be a function. It was just, I believe this is what the organization should do, and it ended up turning into a role. But it was all based on the needs of the organization. So I think just having some of those different experiences growing up, and of course, it's a challenge when your folks split, and then you go from being okay financially to having being in a much more difficult position, and then it improved again. But I've seen multiple sides of that throughout my childhood growing up. So all of those experiences, like all of us have, right, I think have been helpful and have shaped the way in which I approach work, and probably it shaped the way in which or not probably, definitely shaped the way in which I approach leadership.
Yeah, well, it's interesting that you're almost quite an entrepreneur, but yet within an organization. I think the term they use is intrapreneur.
Okay,
That
that's right.
you're an entrepreneur within a big corporation, thinking of different ideas. And one of the guys I'm going to be interviewing shortly has just written a book called The Dyslexic Edge, which I've got just over my right shoulder. I'm going to give a little promote for Jamie Waller and his Dyslexic Edge. Here it is.
Oh, okay.
And Jamie unleashed the power of thinking differently. He interviewed a whole range of different leaders who've become multimillionaires. I think something like I think 40% of multimillionaire businessmen are dyslexic. Um, it's a phenomenal amount. But also, of course, in the prisons, 50% of prisoners are dyslexic. So you can either go one of two ways. Well, you can go one of many ways. But the reason I say that is just I'm dyslexic. And it's certainly been something that's helped me think differently. But though for a long time I thought I was just stupid and thick, and I've been told so by my teachers who didn't know that I was dyslexic. I wonder if you growing up ever wondered and tested whether you were dyslexic because of this entrepreneurial flair. What do you reckon?
I don't, I mean, I haven't been, and I don't think so. I think that's one thing that I escaped. So, yeah, I don't, my brother-in-law grew up with some challenges with that. So, he shared his experiences. So, yeah, I know what it's been like for him, and the days he's had to study and work inside while he's told me everyone else is out there playing. I know that feeling, but so I have some experience, but not personally with that one at least.
Yeah, no, I relate to that. I was that man who did that. Um, the podcast is all about inspiring leadership. I've found your story and the work you do very inspiring, and the fact that it's very aligned with your own values, and the fact that you had, various illnesses throughout your life, and therefore health and longevity and wellness and being pain free is very important to you. So to do work that's linked to something that means a lot to you is important. Um, and I just wondered about inspiring leaders that you've known, both in Novo Nordisk, there might be some you want to call out, and other organizations. Who would you like to call out, and what was it about them that you find inspiring?
That's a good question. I think about when I first joined, what I didn't know and wasn't told until after I joined the organization was that this was probably our third and final attempt at making an imprint in the US market. It just wasn't really going much of anywhere. A very small company at the time, or relatively small to what we are now. And then we had President Martin Suiters, who came over from Denmark. He was at headquarters to lead the organization and give it a go. And what I remember most about that was one of the first meetings we had. We were in the boardroom. I was in there too for some reason, but we were in the boardroom, and the head of marketing was essentially drawing out the outlook for the company in the US. And he drew a flat line. It was a forecast he was drawing out on a whiteboard. And then he drew a dotted line underneath that actually dipped downward. So what he was saying is the best we could do is maintain, but in the face of competition, et cetera, it's possible that we have a declining arc. And I will never forget this. The President Martin at the time just sat there. It felt like a 2, 3 minutes, and you could feel the energy building a little bit. And finally, he said, "That's not very exciting to me. If that's what I bring back to my bosses, I should be fired, which I can't be." So he was essentially signaling that he's there for a reason to make it work. And I remember thinking, wow, let's see then. That's a pretty powerful statement. He ended up corralling the organization and showed them what a growth trajectory that was shown on a slide in the front of the company meeting that looked like it was through the roof. I mean, just an enormous slope that people were looking around thinking, wow, that's very different over the next 5 years. And then he had us all have a book, and it was a 5 year, it was a plan. I don't remember the year, but it was the 5 years forward and had that year on the cover. It was already pre-printed. It was people prepared for this. And we met in these little group circles and wrote down ideas of how we could get there. So, and it worked. If you're fast forwarding 5 years, right? So, and there are a lot of underlying reasons for that, but what I think was inspiring to me was one, challenging the expectation that we cannot do it, that this won't be successful, painting a picture of something that looked not just slightly different, but dramatically different, right? A complete course reversal. And then involving the organization in how to get there, painting a picture of what that vision looks like, and then how to get there. And I thought that whole sequence was just a very powerful way in which you can shift an organization. Sometimes these companies are almost like they're so large they become, and it wasn't even that big at the time, but still, it was a big enough company where they become almost like a ship, a cruise ship or a battleship, and it's just hard to steer. And some leave, some get on, and it's still moving. But to be able to change direction like that had a big impact on the company, obviously, but also had a big impact on people who were around at that time and who were part of that.
And Martin Surters, is he still around or is he retired now?
No, he's long retired, but he actually showed up at the office, I think a couple months ago. I wasn't able to catch him, but he was there back in the US office. So
Wow, that would be really special. I'd love to meet that guy. What an incredible guy. And in your job with sort of strategic direction and getting the curve to go upwards, um, how do you motivate your colleagues to follow a new strategy that you've got? What's your advice? What's your tip?
I mean, I think having a North Star is important. I mentioned earlier around a patient ambition. I mean, for us, that's important because we hadn't had that before. And the thought was, why is it important to have a certain number of patients on your products? We thought because our products are very good, and the those who work on them in the lab and who work with them in clinical development, et cetera, all the way through, put a tremendous amount of evidence behind the products, and it's a very rigorous approach. I mean, this is a science-based company, so therefore, more patients on very good products would lead to better outcomes. So I think having that North Star is important, but there's probably two things that come to mind behind that. One is that co-creation can be very effective if it's done right.
Mm,
And for us, we really try to ensure that we provide the proper guardrails so we don't have you could say, a diluted bottom up type of approach when you're developing strategy, because that doesn't work in and of itself, but it can't be just top down either. So having an effective co-creation model, we actually have an extended strategy team, you could say. They don't report to us. They're just people who touch various elements of strategy across the organization. But we get together as a core group regularly to beat up some of the really challenging issues before they go to the broader organization or to the C-suite. So that's a very collaborative. I ask people, myself included, wear your functional hat, but also wear your hat of the strategy team. So I
mm,
think that co-creation approach has been successful for us. The other piece is putting a very high focus on, you could say, change management. How do people view the organization and the strategy that we put in place? Can they see themselves in it? And for strategists, it's interesting because the easy answer to that is you have a strategy where everyone can easily see themselves in it. And that could dangerously become just not a strategy with it has no trade-offs, just a description of your business if everything is listed there, right? So when you have a strategy where you're actually making some trade-offs, some things are going to be deprioritized. Some
Mm.
things might not even show up on your strategy. And that's where it becomes, well, then how do you motivate people if you end up in that scenario, which you should if you have a good strategy? And one of the ways we did that was when we made that shift I talked about earlier uh, toward the GLP-1s and Wegovy and Ozempic, or the precursors for that, leading into those assets or those therapies, is we wanted to be very careful that we're not saying something is more important than something else. Because if you're out there in North Carolina, Iowa, and you're a sales representative and you're selling and you're calling on these doctors to show them you have insulin, you have other products in your bag, these are all important. And the doctors need them, the patients need them. So we thought, how do we have a strategy that emphasizes trade-offs and prioritization, but doesn't make people feel left out? So what we did there was we actually had four big must-win battles, and they were all on the same level. But two were growth focused, two were foundational business. And by doing that, it's still a strategy. It had its trade-offs. People could see themselves in it, but in different roles. And I think that's how we were able to galvanize the organization around a common direction.
I love that one. And before we go into end with the 2 minute top tip, practical leadership tip that you're going to share with us, looking ahead, what do you believe will be the future of Novo Nordisk?
Well, I mean, I do believe that there's a commitment to prevention. I mean, we are committed to driving change in how the world sees, prevents, and treats obesity, for example, together with our partners. So I think there's a commitment there that's super exciting, and really the opportunity to treat so many more suffering people living with obesity, which we said is a gateway disease, and or diabetes. So being able to attack these problems and importantly prevent some of these downstream issues that occur, that impacts population health and also helps address some of the challenges in the healthcare system, which is why we have potentially some of these CEOs of the consumer packaged goods companies calling up our CEO, right, when their sales are down. So you see the impact and at scale that what we have and what we brought to the market has made. And so I think that's one big one, in addition to the expansion into new diseases with new MOAs, and that spans from common diseases all the way through very rare diseases. And that's really important to me because those are the ones that can you don't have a lot of partners. You can get lost in the system and feel like no one cares or no one understands you. So when we're in those rare diseases, I mean, to me, that's super inspiring.
Hmm. And it relates to your own life. And let me, before we go into your top tip, share a story because I think you're the log jam man. Let me tell you the story. So I was in the Canadian Rockies with my troop when I was in the army. We were doing adventure training. So between wars and operations, you got to keep the guys stretched, and you as the officer have to do difficult things and plan stuff and do things that are rather dangerous. Anyway, we were hiking through some pretty mountainous, remote spots and we had a helicopter that hovered over our heads, and some guys abseiled down into the forest that were in with their chainsaws and stuff. It was the logging team. And below us, we could see way down the mountain this beautiful lake below with the sawmill in there. And we were, how are they going to get the logs from in the middle of this forest here? There's no roads down to the sawmill. And the guy said, "Yeah, come and join us." And he showed us, and he was sawing down these trees and slicing them up into bits. And he said, "Look, we just roll them into this huge, fast-flowing river that's going down the mountain." And I said, "So, do you have any problems?" He said, "Oh yeah, look at the bends. Come down here." And we walked down the hill, and on the bend there was this pile of logs, and these logs were smashing into the other logs. And he goes, "Do you want to go in there and try and lift off the top log?" I said, "No way, I'll get killed by the next one's coming down." He said, "Exactly." He said, "So I've got to find a way to unjam this 20 logs that are all stuck here." And he said, and I've got to choose not just any log, but the right log. So he said, from experience, he said, it's that log. And he took a harpoon, sort of rifle affair, and he fired a harpoon into that log from a distance and then attached it to the tree with a pulley and pressed a button. It pulled that log out and the whole lot went down the stream. And that's your job, mate. You, David, are the logjam man, and you got to work out if you could nail the obesity, pull that, and all the others will go with it. But if you just try and do it one disease at a time, you're not getting to the root of the problem. Do you like that story? You can take it and use it as your own. There's
I
my
do,
gift
I do, I do. I might have to summarize that and
in your own
package it, but
story.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, well, good. So, the final bit, would you kindly say who you are, the work that you do, explain about the organization with just 2 minutes, what Novo Nordisk does, and what your practical top leadership tip is, and that will end us nicely, David.
Sure. I mean, so Novo Nordisk is obviously focused on treating and in some cases really driving change within chronic diseases in obesity, diabetes, and cardiovascular, as well as rare disease. So it's a company that has been around, like I mentioned, 100+ years with a history in diabetes and particularly in insulin development, but has expanded pretty dramatically to be a multi-therapeutic company. But the end goal is still the same: to treat, prevent diseases, and improve the outcomes of people who suffer with these conditions, whether it's something that's very rare, and we have a product called Rifloza out there, so people can look that up, but it's also something, or chronic conditions that affect tens and tens of millions of patients. So we have a pretty broad spectrum, but the goal is the same: to improve the outcomes and the lives that patients have.
Great. So, David Kamenir, who is the VP North America at Novo Nordisk, what is your top tip?
As you could probably tell by now, I believe heavily in accountability and ownership. One thing that I've done is I ask people, particularly when I feel on my teams or people I'm working with that might be getting a little complacent, I said, imagine if you were at the front of the building right now, at the front desk, with your badge, but instead of the one you have now, which has your face on it and has a department on it and is a permanent badge, imagine you had a vendor badge or a temporary badge. Would you still be able to get in the door? Would the value proposition that you're bringing today with the temporary badge at the front desk get you in the door? And often it's been a wake-up call, and people realize maybe I'm not taking the ownership that I need and fighting for as if my this company depends on what I'm bringing to the organization. So it's been a bit of a wake-up call. I mean, it's one tip, but I've used things like that because again, I do have that background where you have to think about how are you paying for the lights? How are you, my family has companies that are, you have a purity of, you're bringing some to the market and you have to really fight to make sure that every day that it works and you're very, very connected to it. So same thing here, people in a big organization, sometimes you can get a little lost there, but that's a tip that I think has helped be a wake-up call and people realize, yep, maybe not, maybe I do need to come with something a little sharper.
Yeah, accountability and ownership. I absolutely love it. So, David, thank you very much for being on the Inspiring Leadership podcast. Good luck with the work you're doing, and please continue to live a life on purpose rather than off purpose. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Again, my first one, hopefully it was up to par enough, but
It was
I
indeed.
appreciate the opportunity to share some of these things and have a conversation with you.
Thank you very much. Bye for now.
Bye.